Some new developments in the Nancy Guthrie case. This is new information that I'm going to share with you guys that I just received a little while ago from a source very close to the investigation that has to do with the ransom notes, the second ransom note in particular. Remember the ones that went to the local TV stations in Tucson, Arizona. And I want to read you this exactly because I wrote down exactly what I was able to get from my source. I am told that the second ransom note in the Nancy Guthrie case said that she died and that she was, quote, buried with nature now. And again, this is according to a source close to the investigation. The note indicated that Nancy's death was not intentional, but did not offer a direct apology. Again, I'm going to read it to you again. According to my source, the second ransom note in the Nancy Guthrie case said she died and was buried with nature now, and that the death was not intentional, but did not offer a direct apology. There's been some other reporting today from other people saying that it was an apology. I am told it was not a direct apology, but that it did indicate that the death was not intentional. Again, this is the second ransom note.
While investigators were still processing the physical evidence from Nancy's home, something else was happening that would pull this case in a completely different direction. Notes started arriving, and not to the FBI, not to the Guthrie family directly, to the media. The first note landed at Cold, the CBS affiliate based in Tucson, Arizona. The message made a direct demand: cryptocurrency in exchange for Nancy Guthrie's safe return. It claimed she was alive. It claimed she was scared. But here is the detail that stopped investigators cold. The note contained specific information about what Nancy was wearing on the night she was taken. That is not the kind of detail you get from watching the news. That is the kind of detail you only know if you were there. It was enough for the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department to begin treating the note as potentially credible and to immediately start working to trace its origin. Then a second demand surfaced: $4 million in Bitcoin. The sender gave the family 4 days to pay or the amount would increase. The language was direct and left no room for negotiation. The note used the phrase, "or else." A deadline was set for 5 p.m. on February 9th. Investigators monitored the situation closely. That deadline came and passed. No further contact followed from whoever sent it. But this is also where the case picked up a layer of noise that complicated everything. On February 5th, a California man named Derek Colella, 42 years old, was arrested on federal charges. The FBI found that on February 4th, Colella had sent 2 separate text messages to members of the Guthrie family. Both messages asked whether the Bitcoin had been sent yet and indicated he was waiting on the transaction. Colella later told investigators he had been following the case on television and had pulled the family's contact information from an online source. He was charged with transmitting a demand for ransom in interstate commerce and using a telecommunications device to threaten and harass. Investigators confirmed his scheme had absolutely no connection to the notes sent to Cold or to the credible ransom communications already under review. He was an opportunist who saw a family in crisis and tried to exploit it. That distinction matters because it means the real sender was still out there. And then the second note sent to Cold arrived. This one was different enough that the station's own news director publicly stated she would not categorize it as a ransom note. There was no new demand. There was no price attached. What it said instead was far harder to process. According to sources close to the investigation, the note claimed Nancy Guthrie had died shortly after she was taken. It stated she had been buried with nature. It indicated her death had not been intentional. It did not offer a direct apology. It did not ask for anything in return. It was not a negotiation. It read more like a disclosure. When Savannah Guthrie released a video on Instagram shortly after that second note was received, the words she chose suddenly carried a different weight. She sat alongside her brother Cameron and her sister Annie, and she looked directly into the camera. She said, "We received your message and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay." The video ran for 20 seconds. She never specified what message she was referring to. She never confirmed what the note contained. But for anyone paying close attention, the tone of that video was not the tone of a family still fully holding on to hope. It was the tone of people trying to keep a door open that may have already been closing. TMZ entered the picture around this time as well, reporting that notes they had received made no mention of Nancy's death and contained no apology. The problem is that it was never publicly confirmed whether TMZ received the same notes that went to the Tucson television stations. That discrepancy was raised and never resolved. Two sets of notes, potentially two different senders, or the same sender using different channels to deliver different messages. Nobody could say for certain. Former FBI agents who commented publicly on the case made one point repeatedly. Routing ransom notes through media outlets instead of directly to the family is highly unusual behavior for a kidnapper. It suggests either a lack of direct access to the family, an intention to keep the case public, or an amateur who did not understand how these situations typically operate. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore offered a sharp assessment of what the notes communicated beyond their words. In his experience, kidnappers who destroy hope rather than build it are almost always doing so because they have nothing left to trade. A kidnapper with a live victim uses hope as leverage. They keep the family believing because belief is what keeps ransom negotiations alive. A note that tells a family their loved one is gone and offers no path forward is not a negotiating tool. It is the behavior of someone who has already lost control of the situation. Moore also addressed the question of whether any of the notes contained an apology. His answer was clear. In his career, he had never encountered a kidnapper who apologized, except in the context of pre-sentencing statements in court. He called it extremely unusual, and he noted that if a genuinely conciliatory tone had been present in any of the notes, it would have produced a visible shift in how law enforcement responded. Assignments would have changed, resources would have been redirected, the public response from the Guthrie family would have carried a different energy. None of that happened. The FBI's position on the ransom payment itself was grounded in a principle that does not bend easily, even under the most painful circumstances. Paying a ransom without any proof of life sets a precedent that puts future victims at greater risk. It also statistically reduces the chance of recovering the victim alive because it removes the only remaining leverage the family has. The Guthrie family made their position clear publicly. They were willing to pay. They said so on camera. But the money was never transferred. There was a counter-argument circulating among investigators and analysts. Bitcoin, once it is withdrawn from a wallet, becomes significantly easier to trace. The theory was that allowing a payment to go through could generate a lead that no amount of tip line calls could produce. The argument had merit, but it had to be weighed against the possibility of losing millions of dollars with no victim returned and no suspect identified. That debate reached no public resolution. Then on June 22, 2026, more than 4 months after Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home, another note surfaced. It claimed Nancy was dead. The Pima County Sheriff's Department issued a statement confirming they were aware of reports surrounding the note and that all materials were being forwarded directly to detectives working alongside the FBI. No further details were released. The investigation continued. Every note in this case raises more questions than it answers. That is what makes this story so difficult to walk away from and so important to keep following. This is exactly the kind of case we built Cold Case News Nation to cover. If you are not subscribed yet, do it now, because when the truth finally comes out in this case, you are going to want to be here for it. By the time the ransom notes had run their course through the news cycle, the investigation itself had entered a different and far more frustrating phase. The early urgency of the first 2 weeks, the raids, the DNA collection, the doorbell footage, the reward announcements, had given way to something investigators and families dread equally: silence. And into that silence walked everyone who had an opinion, a camera, or an agenda. Throughout this case, one journalist had remained closer to the investigation than almost any other outside the official task force. Brian Enton, reporting for News Nation, was the same journalist whose source inside the investigation first disclosed the specific contents of the second ransom note, the one that claimed Nancy had died and had been buried with nature. That sourcing did not happen by accident. Enton had been working this case from the ground in Tucson since the earliest days, building relationships and following developments in real time. His reporting drove several of the most significant news cycles surrounding the case, and his access to sources close to the investigation gave the public details that official statements had not yet confirmed. In a case where law enforcement was deliberately tight with information, his work filled a critical gap. One of the analysts Entine consulted repeatedly was retired FBI agent Steve Moore. At this stage of the investigation, Moore's focus shifted away from the content of any individual note and toward a bigger question that had been hovering over the case for weeks. How many of the notes circulating in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance were actually real? Moore was direct. He was skeptical that more than 2 or 3 of all the notes received were genuinely from whoever took Nancy. His reasoning was grounded in how the FBI approaches document analysis. Behavioral scientists and forensic linguists do not simply read a note. They study it, they look at handwriting patterns and whether lines slope upward or downward under pressure. They track spelling choices and whether errors are consistent across documents. They analyze vocabulary and sentence construction to determine whether 2 notes were written by the same person or by 2 different individuals entirely. They look for what is present and for what is conspicuously absent. Moore explained that in a high-profile case like this one, the moment ransom notes become public knowledge, fabricators emerge. People begin mimicking the language they have seen reported. Some do it for attention. Some do it believing they can extract money from a grieving family. The FBI's job is to cut through all of that and isolate the communications that carry the internal consistency of someone who was actually present. Moore's estimate was that a minority of the notes were likely genuine, and that within that minority, the FBI had probably reached internal agreement on which ones carried the most credibility. He noted that in his experience, getting 8 out of 10 agents in a room to agree on the authenticity of a document was a reasonable threshold for moving forward, even if 2 remained unconvinced. The question of whether the ransom should have been paid resurfaced publicly around this time through a report published by Airmail. The report raised a pointed concern that a decision made by the FBI task force in early February, specifically the decision not to pay the ransom, was now being viewed internally as a potentially significant misstep. The argument was that paying the $4 million Bitcoin demand, even without proof of life, may have generated a traceable transaction that could have identified the suspect. The decision not to pay had been made based on sound investigative principles. But principles and outcomes are 2 different things, and as the months passed with no arrest and no recovery, the weight of that early call was beginning to show. When Enton raised this with Moore, Moore acknowledged that every major investigative decision gets reviewed after the fact. He called it a hot wash, the debrief that follows any operation regardless of outcome. He said there is not a single retired agent he knows who does not still wake up at 4 in the morning thinking about a case and wondering what would have happened if one decision had gone differently. He stopped short of saying the FBI was wrong, but he did not say they were right either. Friction between the 2 lead agencies on the case also became harder to ignore as the investigation stretched into its 4th and 5th months. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos and FBI Director Kash Patel had publicly clashed over the direction and communication strategy of the investigation. The specific nature of their disagreements was not fully disclosed publicly, but the tension between local law enforcement and federal leadership was visible enough that it became part of the public conversation. In a joint investigation of this scale, that kind of friction can slow decisions and create gaps in coordination that a suspect benefits from directly. The geographic scope of the search also expanded during this period. Brian Enton raised the question of whether the proximity of Tucson to the Mexican border, and specifically to the Tohono O'odham Nation Reservation, a stretch of land that runs between Tucson and Mexico, should factor more prominently into the search. The reservation covers a vast, largely isolated area. When Enton asked Steve Moore about it, Moore addressed the terrain carefully. He noted that the FBI has what he described as a delicate relationship with tribal police on the reservation. Federal agents do not have automatic enforcement powers on tribal land. Coordination requires a specific kind of diplomacy and cannot be assumed. Moore did not suggest any confirmed connection between the reservation and Nancy's disappearance, but he acknowledged that the combination of isolation, limited surveillance infrastructure, and restricted federal access made the area genuinely difficult to work. Then in June 2026, an anonymous tip pushed that geographic thread further. A group that specializes in locating missing persons in Mexico received information from an anonymous source claiming that Nancy Guthrie was buried in an unmarked grave approximately 70 miles from her Tucson home near the United States and Mexico border. The group took the tip seriously and launched a search. The Pima County Sheriff's Department was asked about it publicly and issued a statement confirming they were aware of the reports but had not been contacted by Mexican authorities regarding the tip. The search turned up nothing. The tip remains unverified and unresolved. And then the neighborhood itself became a story. As weeks turned into months and the investigation produced no public breakthrough, the Catalina foothills area around Nancy's home became a gathering point for online true crime content creators. Some came to report, some came to live stream, some came for reasons that were harder to categorize. Neighbors began filing complaints with the Pima County Sheriff's Department. They reported individuals blocking roadways, trespassing near the property, and setting up makeshift camps in the surrounding area. On June 8th, 2 men were sighted outside Nancy's home. Troy Lewis Bradshaw, 34 years old, and Damian Todd Enderly, 46 years old, were both charged with public nuisance. A third man, Alexander Zabel Jr., 54, was arrested the same day on suspicion of obstructing a highway and public nuisance. Sheriff Nanos later revealed that a video had surfaced of one of the individuals urinating in public behind a makeshift tent near the property. 3 days later, on June 11th, Zabel was back. He was outside Nancy's home again, this time conducting a live stream for his YouTube channel called Criminal Network. Deputies arrived and made contact with him. What followed was captured on the live stream itself. As deputies told Zabel he was under arrest, the situation escalated. During the arrest process, a Pima County Sheriff's sergeant was knocked to the ground. Zabel was taken into custody, and a third deputy arrived to assist. He was booked into the Pima County Adult Detention Complex on charges of resisting arrest and public nuisance. Sheriff Nanos announced that stricter enforcement measures would be implemented in the neighborhood going forward. TMZ's involvement added another layer of complexity that Steve Moore addressed without hesitation. TMZ had approached the FBI with an offer to pay the Bitcoin ransom themselves in order to trace where the money went. The FBI's initial response was that the idea was interesting and that they would follow up. They never did. TMZ reported publicly that despite reaching out to the FBI at least half a dozen times after that initial response, the agency had gone completely silent. Moore's take was unambiguous. Partnering with a media organization on an active kidnapping investigation offers no legitimate law enforcement value. It introduces public exposure at every stage of a process that depends on controlled information. He noted that the FBI's silence was not confusion, it was a decision. Meanwhile, the core investigative work continued grinding forward. Sheriff Nanos addressed the public timeline directly, explaining that the delays in the investigation were largely driven by the pace of laboratory work. The mixed DNA samples recovered from Nancy's home, including the hair found at the scene, had been sent to the FBI's laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. That process cannot be rushed without compromising the results. Nanos urged patience and stated that the investigation was moving exactly as it needed to move. Retired Detective John Bueller, who had worked the Lacey Peterson case and was also speaking with Brian Enton throughout this period, offered a different kind of perspective on the timeline. He believed the answer to this case might already exist somewhere inside the thousands of tips that had flooded in since February. He pointed out that in investigations of this scale, tip prioritization is imperfect. The sheer volume means that something credible can sit in a queue longer than it should. He said plainly that there might already be something in the tip pool waiting to be reached that could break the case wide open. The only question was whether investigators would get to it in time. As of June 2026, Nancy Guthrie has been missing for nearly 5 months. No suspect has been publicly named, no arrest has been made, no confirmed location has been identified, and the woman at the center of all of it, an 84-year-old grandmother who had lived quietly and independently in the Catalina foothills for decades, has not been found. The DNA samples collected from her home remain at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, still being processed. The mixed samples, which include genetic material that does not belong to Nancy or anyone confirmed to have been in close contact with her, represent one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence still in play. The hair recovered from the scene is among those samples. Sheriff Nanos has been consistent in his message to the public about the timeline. This kind of forensic work cannot be compressed without compromising its integrity in court. Every result has to be airtight before it can be used to move against a suspect. That standard is not a bureaucratic delay. It is the difference between an arrest that leads to a conviction and one that collapses under legal scrutiny. The reward for information in this case remains among the largest ever offered in a missing persons investigation in Arizona. The Guthrie family is offering $1 million. The FBI has contributed $100,000 of its own. The combined total sits at $1.2 million for any information that leads to Nancy's recovery or to the arrest and conviction of anyone involved in her disappearance. If you have information, the Pima County Sheriff's Department tip line is 520-351-4900. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Both lines remain active. On April 6, 2026, Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show desk for the first time since her mother was taken. It had been more than 2 months. She had stepped away from her role covering the 2026 Winter Olympics and had spent that time split between public appeals for her mother's return and the private reality of a family living inside an open wound. Her return to television was not a signal that anything had been resolved. It was a decision to keep living while the search continued. In her first sit-down interview following Nancy's disappearance, speaking with her former co-host Hoda Copes, Savannah was asked what she knew. Her answer was 4 words. Honestly, we do not know anything. She said her family cannot be at peace without answers. She said it is never too late for someone to do the right thing. She was not speaking to journalists. She was speaking directly to whoever is responsible. Mother's Day came in May 2026. It marked nearly 100 days since Nancy was taken. Savannah shared a public tribute to her mother on social media. The milestone passed without a breakthrough, without an arrest, without a phone call that changed anything. For a family that has lived every single day of those 100 days not knowing whether their mother is alive or where she is, that silence is its own kind of weight. In the middle of all of this, Savannah made a decision that said something about who she is and what she believes this moment should mean beyond her own family. She donated $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Her stated reason was direct. The attention that surrounded her mother's case was extraordinary. National headlines, international reporters, presidential phone calls, a combined reward that most missing persons cases will never see. And she was aware that thousands of other families were living through the same nightmare with none of that. Her donation was an acknowledgement that Nancy Guthrie's case mattered, and so did every case that never made the front page. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer raised a challenge in June 2026 that has not been answered publicly. She stated plainly that an enhanced image of the masked man seen on Nancy's doorbell camera exists. It has not been released to the public. Coffindaffer, who spent 25 years with the FBI, asked publicly why that image was being withheld. She argued that putting the suspect's face on billboards, with text in both English and Spanish, given the demographics of the Tucson region, would generate more actionable leads than keeping Nancy's face as the primary image in public outreach. Her question was pointed and deliberate. She suggested that if law enforcement is sitting on an enhanced image of the suspect and not releasing it, there may be a reason. And that reason could mean they already have a working theory about who Porch Guy is. That question remains open. Retired Detective John Bueller offered what may be the most quietly optimistic assessment of where this investigation could still go. He pointed to something most people do not think about when they think about solving a crime: the car. Modern vehicles, anything manufactured in the last several years, contain GPS tracking data embedded in the vehicle's own systems. If someone drove to Nancy Guthrie's address in Tucson on the night of January 31st into the early hours of February 1st, and if that vehicle was new enough to carry that kind of tracking capability, that data potentially still exists. Beyond that, if anyone searched Nancy's address using Google Maps or any navigation application in the days or weeks leading up to her abduction, those search records are subpoenable. Reverse keyword searches, where investigators ask a court to compel a technology company to identify every account that searched a specific address within a defined time window, have cracked cases that seem to have no leads at all. Bueller's position was clear. The case is not closed. The tools available to investigators have not been exhausted, and somewhere inside the thousands of tips still being processed, there may already be the piece of information that changes everything. This case drew attention from every corner of the world. Reporters from China and Australia were among the international journalists who covered developments live from the streets of Tucson. Outside Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills, Members of the community placed yellow roses and yellow ribbons, a quiet, sustained expression of a neighborhood that has not forgotten the woman who lived there and has not stopped hoping she comes home. What remains unanswered is the full shape of this case. Who is the masked man on the doorbell footage? Where is Nancy Guthrie? Are any of the ransom notes still arriving genuine, or are they the work of opportunists feeding on a story that refuses to go quiet? What will the DNA at Quantico reveal when results are finalized? And the question that may never have a clean answer: did a decision made in the first week of February, when a ransom demand sat on the table and a family was willing to pay, alter the outcome of this case in a way that cannot be undone? The investigation is open. The FBI is working. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is working. And Nancy Guthrie's family is still waiting. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. This case is still moving, and Cold Case News Nation will be here every single time it does. If this video gave you something that no other source has put together in one place, subscribe right now and share it with someone who follows cases like this one. The more people who see this video, the greater the chance that someone watching has a piece of information, something they saw, something they heard, something they dismissed at the time, that could help bring Nancy home. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from and what you think happened on the night of February 1st. We read every single one.